Excellent, the king says to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse. Haman's getting all excited. I would love to have been a fly on the wall and see the expression on that man's face. Quick, the king says, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave nothing out you have suggested. So yeah, we don't get any details. This is just left up to your imagination. But verse 11, so Haman took the robes. He had to have been cursing and swearing as he did this, honestly. Hi, and welcome to One Little Candle, a weekly podcast where we provide you with valuable content that will ignite your faith and empower you, believer, to make a difference in your own little corner of the world. I'm your host, Rebecca Berschwinger. In each episode, we tackle various issues that impact our faith and the world around us, like spiritual warfare and cultural issues. You'll also meet some amazing guests who stop by from time to time to share their inspiring testimonies, all with the goal of equipping you to be a shining light in a dark world, no matter how small your sphere of influence may seem, because even the smallest actions can have a profound impact. Remember, all it takes is one little candle to dispel the darkness. So what do you say? Are you ready to let your light shine?
It's the light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
Well, hello and how are you today? Welcome back to One Little Candle. If you've been here before, if this is your first time, welcome. I'm so happy to have you as well. We are going to get right into things today and dig into chapters 4 through 7 of the Book of Esther. Now, if you haven't listened to chapters 1 through 3, the previous episode, please go back and do so. But for those of you who are ready right now, quick review of our story, what we covered last week in chapters 1 through 3. And we have an arrogant, pompous pagan king who becomes angry with his queen. And he, one thing I've noticed about King Xerxes is I feel like he doesn't really think for himself. And he's always surrounding himself with these so-called wise advisors who actually are just honestly a bunch of idiots. But then again, God has control over idiots as well, right? But yes, he's angry with his queen. He wants her banished. And so he puts this law into effect. And all the virgins in the kingdom are rounded up and brought to the fortress of Susa, where the king's palace is. And amongst these virgins was a young Jewish woman by the name of Hadassah. And so these virgins, when they were brought in, they were placed into harems. And so from among these virgins, the king is going to pick out a new queen for himself. And as we saw, God was doing his handiwork and orchestrating things so that a simple nobody in the kingdom of Persia, a Jewish girl, I'm sure unheard of, had access to a wealthy, powerful pagan king. And we have our enemy Haman, who is anti-Semitic, Jew hater, and he's the epitome of pride and arrogance. And he becomes angry that Mordecai refuses to bow to him or pay him homage. So he comes up with a plan not to just get even with Mordecai, but every Jew within that Persian empire there. So he convinces the king to, again, I don't know why this king doesn't think for himself, but he convinces King Xerxes to issue an edict that says that in a year, on a specific day, all the Jews, young and old, are to be annihilated and everything of theirs plundered. And so Susa falls into chaos, despair, and confusion, while Haman and King Xerxes are kind of putting their feet up and having a toast to this decision. So that is where we left off. All right. And again, I am using the NLT version for this. And here we are, chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, this is the edict to kill the Jews, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. Now think about this, okay? Mordecai, you want to talk about the weight of the world on your shoulders? He realizes that it was his refusal to bow to Haman that has caused this edict, this law that says that the Jews are to be killed. And so I'm sure he is obviously plagued with guilt and despair. That word seems to be coming into play quite a bit here. But yes, he's mourning for himself, for his cousin Esther, and for his people. But it says he went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And as we know, sackcloth and ashes, back in that culture, that was how they mourned. It says in verse 3, and in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, because Mordecai wouldn't even be able to come near or approach her dressed like that. But it says he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. So Hathach goes, he tells Esther what Mordecai says, and she tells Hathach to go to Mordecai, go back to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces, they know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. That law, to be put to death. Okay? If someone enters there and tries to speak to the king without the king extending his golden scepter to him, it's an instant death sentence. So you don't speak to that king, okay? You don't come out alive unless he holds out this golden scepter to you. And so the reason that this was done was to protect the king's life from would-be assassins. So I guess the king would extend the scepter, which was a sign of his authority, but he would only extend it to those whom he knew and he could trust, those who he welcomed a visit from. So you better hope that when you decide to approach the king, he's not in a bad mood, right? Maybe he doesn't feel like extending his golden scepter, so off with your head. So Esther reminds Mordecai, or lets him know about the law, about the golden scepter, and she says, as for me, I haven't been called to come into the king these 30 days, so it's been a month. She's heard nothing from the king, and she's probably wondering, maybe I have lost favor with the king. Maybe he doesn't want me anymore. And so they tell Mordecai what Esther says. And so in verse 13 it says, then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. So he says, hey, Esther, you're a Jew, remember? Just because you're behind those palace walls doesn't mean that they're going to spare your life either, because the edict says that all Jews must be annihilated. Sorry, in this instance, her being a queen would not spare her life. But then he says to her, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. So Mordecai obviously is thinking, look, God will deliver us. Perhaps remembering God's promise to Abraham that God will deliver them, but it may not come from Esther. She and Mordecai will end up perishing. And he says, "Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" And so right here, without saying so, but in so many words, really Mordecai is indirectly appealing to God's providential timing. Okay. So Esther sends a message back to Mordecai, and she says to gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, to hold a fast on her behalf. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I think about that. It's one thing to not eat. That's okay. But to not drink, for me, when I'm fasting, I rely a lot on liquids, okay? Water, or sometimes water with a little bit of juice or something in it to keep me comfortable, to keep me going. So this is no food or drink, and this is for 3 days. And she said, "I and my young women will also fast as you do." So she's not just telling everyone else to fast. She and her maids are also going to do the same thing. And she says, "Then I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law. And you know what? Well, if I perish, I perish." So here we have, I'd say, the heroine coming out in Esther. She is willing to give her life on behalf of her people, on behalf of the Jews. So it says, Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther ordered him. Chapter 5, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. You think she was trembling at all? I would be literally shaking. The adrenaline would be really pumping because she hasn't heard from him. She has no idea what her standing is with him right now. And if he doesn't extend that golden scepter to her, that's it. But as fate would have it, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, thank you, God, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." Yeah, he's offering to give her whatever she wants, even if she wants half the kingdom. And I think to myself, did he really mean that? Or was he just kind of, how people do that sometimes, just assuming that most certainly isn't what she would want, but it sounds good to offer it. But John MacArthur's commentary says, even to the half of my kingdom was royal hyperbole that was really not intended to be taken at face value. So, I don't know. But Esther replies, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. So verse 6, and as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." So Esther answers, "Well, my wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." When I read language like this, and I just realized I just read the first chapter and a half from the ESV, even though I meant to be using the NLT. Because I have the ESV here in front of me, too, for some commentary. But, oh, well, that's how it's staying. But, I want to comment here for just a second on the language, or the way they said things back then compared to today, and how differently they went about it. And I'm sure you've probably noticed this many times in the Bible, but when Esther was requesting from the king to have another feast, she says, "This is my request and deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, Please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about. Well, in today's language, it would have been like, well, King Xerxes, if it's okay with you, I'd like to do this again tomorrow. And then I'll let you know what it's about. And that would be it. But I think they were a lot more wordy back then, I guess. Anyway, totally different way of communicating nowadays. Okay, I'm going back to the NLT here. But anyway, she promises that tomorrow at the next banquet that she was going to prepare for the king and Haman, she would explain what it was all about. So verse 9, chapter 5, Haman was a happy man, yeah, I bet he was, as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. Now, see what I mean about the stupidity, the pride and arrogance, the stupidity of it all? Here he was, the only invitee to dine with the king and the queen of a powerful empire. Okay? He's up there. He's rubbing shoulders with the in crowd. Okay? He's wealthy. He's got basically the whole world, so to speak, at his fingertips. But yet he sees one man, Mordecai, the man who refuses to bow to him, and everything just goes out the window. And he's hyper-focused on that because he has this deep hatred of not just Mordecai, but the Jews. And so this just overtakes everything. And I just think about the hatred that we see today of the Jewish people, these pro-Palestine, I'm not going to call names, people. They were blocking the Chicago O'Hare airport, and people were having to leave their cars and walk with their luggage to get to their flights. They blocked off the Golden Gate Bridge. And, I'm just at the point where it's like, and I'm dead serious when I say this, round them up, ship them off to Gaza. They need a dose of reality. And frankly, I don't want these people around my kids or my grandkids, truth be told. But yeah, this is what hate does. It really skews your thinking, and it just overtakes you. But so yes, he's furious, okay? Mordecai just ruined all his fun, the sight of Mordecai. But it says, however, in verse 10, he restrained himself and went on home. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. I guess he had at least 10 sons, but he's bragging about how great his family is and his life and his wealth. And it says he bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. Then Haman added, and that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me. Hear that, guys? Only me. And the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. Guess what? She's actually invited me back tomorrow. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Is this amazing or what? I'm pretty great, aren't I? Then he added, but this is all worth nothing. As long as I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there at the palace gate. So Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends suggested, hey, Haman, how about this? Why don't you set up a sharpened pole that stands about 75 feet tall? And in the morning, ask the king, because he does whatever people tell him. That was me saying that. Ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. And then when this is done, you can just go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. Can you imagine suggesting that to someone? So obviously, they're just as bad as he is. But now they refer to it, the ESV actually calls it a gallows. Okay, it's gallows 50 cubits high. Now, these gallows were actually, which is how the NLT is describing it, is they're not with the noose like we think they are. We picture gallows for hanging. When we hear gallows, we think of someone hanging with a noose around their neck. But it was a stake which they would be impaled to death on, or even displayed up there after their death. So that's what that really was. So yes, Haman's very pleased with his friends and family's advice, and so he has that sharpened pole, 75-foot tall pole, set up. However, God is still busy, right? Chapter 6, verse 1. That night the king had trouble sleeping. Wonder who was causing the insomnia. Maybe he had too much caffeine? Or perhaps it was God. I'd say the latter. But the king orders an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. Why would he ask for that? In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. So he says, well, what reward or recognition did we ever give to Mordecai for this? And the attendants are shrugging their shoulders. Well, actually, Your Highness, nothing's been done for him. Verse 4 says, "Who was that in the outer court?" the king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. So he's there, all confident because the king listens to him. I guarantee you he's positive that the king is going to grant his request. So the attendant says, well, that's Haman out in the court. And so the king says, well, bring him in. So Haman comes in. Now the king asking about Mordecai, okay, they're coming from two different places here. They're both thinking about Mordecai, right? However, one wants to kill him, the other one wants to honor him. And so King Xerxes says, Haman, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Now, as any proud and arrogant and narcissistic person would do, Haman thinks to himself, oh, obviously he's talking about me. And so he replies in a manner in which he himself would love to be honored. And so he says, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. He's got all the details worked out. Wonder how long he fantasized about this one. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Well, that would be him, right? And let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. All right. King Xerxes loves this idea. He couldn't have thought anything up better himself, right? Excellent, the king says to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse. Haman's getting all excited. I would love to have been a fly on the wall and see the expression on that man's face. Quick, the king says, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave nothing out you have suggested. So yeah, we don't get any details. This is just left up to your imagination. But verse 11, so Haman took the robes. He had to have been cursing and swearing as he did this, honestly. Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai. Humble pie. Placed him on the king's own horse and led him through the city square shouting, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home dejected and completely humiliated. My, how the tables have turned. Yet one day, Mordecai is at the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes, and next thing you know, he's arriving there in royal robes on a royal horse, getting all this honor. Verse 13, when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends what had happened, his wise advisors and his wife said, since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him. You know, that's quite the amazing verse. Let me read that again here, their response. For once, these so-called wise men, what they said was wise. He said, "This man is of Jewish birth. You will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him." They must have had an idea of, well, quite an idea of the history of the Jews. Okay? Because the fact is, as John MacArthur says, divine prophecy, neither that nor biblical history was in Haman's favor here, okay? And these people must have known it. They had some knowledge of biblical history, and they were wise enough to say, you know what, maybe you had better let this go. But while they were still talking, in verse 14, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." So Queen Esther replies, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared." So, cat's out of the bag, okay? She's admitting she's a Jew, because this has been kept secret up until now. "For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." Well, now King Xerxes is up in arms. It's a short-term memory. "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out to the palace garden. Whew. Talk about scared to death, right? And as I'm sure Haman was literally trembling in his boots or his sandals or whatever he was wearing. So it says that Haman stayed behind with Queen Esther to plead for his life with her, because he knew what the king's intentions were, and that would be to kill him. So there's that word again, in despair. He fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining. So think about that. She's I can picture her now. She's sitting there. She's got her feet up, one arm over the back of the couch, just kind of chilling, reclining, taking it all in. And we have Haman scared to death, okay? So we got the king. He's coming back from the palace garden, and he sees Haman on the couch. He probably maybe draped himself over Esther's lap in a posture of extreme humility or begging desperation. And the king sees it and he exclaims, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" So the king's taking it much differently than what obviously Haman intended for it to be. But it says, as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Actually, you know what? Come to think of it, Haman, he set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the guy who saved you from assassination." "Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. There is your justice. There is your justice. God is so beautifully woven throughout all of this, and he didn't even need to be explicitly mentioned. He's there, working everyone to his will. It's just amazing. It really is. So, yeah, that was the end of chapter 7. And next week we will continue on with chapters 8 through 10. What a story. And actually, it's very enjoyable just digging into it and commenting on it, because we all need to be reminded of this very thing, the fact that God is sovereign and he's everywhere and nothing gets by him. Nothing. Because I think we all need to be reminded throughout our lives and all the craziness that life brings us and throws our way that, hey, things don't happen for no good reason. They just don't. God is there. He is in it, in the places where we probably least would think he would be. And same thing here. And to me, this was God looking out for Israel and the Jewish people then. And he's doing it now. He's doing it now. And he's doing it for his church. No, the church has not replaced Israel. We are separate. As Christians, we have been graciously grafted in to that tree with the Jewish remnant. But yeah, God is working in our lives as well. As I had said last episode, he's working in your life, my friend. Never, ever doubt or question that. We walk by faith and not by sight. We really, really do. So continue to do that. Don't let your light dim. Don't put it under a bushel. All right? And one way you're sure to put it under a bushel is by just assuming that somehow God has left you or he's abandoned you or he's not, working in your life, because it's just not true. It's just not true. His will be done. I did not do a song last week, but I do have one for this week. This is one of my favorites, and I thought, well, if anyone listening is struggling with having to face the future, not knowing what the future holds, and just wondering if they can even face tomorrow. I love the song called Because He Lives, I Can Face Tomorrow, and that is going to be the song for the week. Please have a listen to it. You hear it? But yes, it's a wonderful song. I will leave the YouTube link for you in the podcast show notes. Have a listen and realize that God is alive. He's alive and well in all of our lives. And so we can face whatever it is that comes our way. So next week, chapters 8 through 10, we will finish up the Book of Esther. Find out exactly how they are going to get out of this mess that Haman and King Xerxes have created. Because it's not going to be as easy as one would think. So looking forward to sharing that with you next week. All right, my friends, until next time, you take care and God bless.
It's the